Evolutionists use our museums to promote their fraudulent displays. Without any feet, hands, or eyeballs ever being discovered, why would the artists who reconstructed the famous Lucy give her human-like hands and feet or eyeballs with visible whites like humans? When Philip Gingerich reconstructed Rodhocetus, he added a tail fluke and fins. How could he know if this creature had either, if no fluke and no fins for it have ever been discovered? In fact, nearly all skeletons of nearly all prehistoric animals that you see in museums are incomplete skeletons that they just pieced together to make the story fit. This isn't science. It's blatant deception. So why do these supposed scientists still present these frauds as fact in our museums? I had to investigate. In 1894, H.G. Wells, still a relatively unknown writer, published this assessment of the problem of public knowledge of science in the journal Nature. Popular science, it is to be feared, is a phrase that conveys a certain flavor of contempt to many a scientific worker. It may be that this contempt is not altogether undeserved, and that a considerable proportion of the science of our magazines, school textbooks, and books for the general reader is the mere obvious tinctured by inaccurate compilation. This expresses the frustration from scientists with the task of summarizing scientific findings in language that is accessible to a common reader. Wells would go on to explain, however, that popularizing science is of extreme importance. But now that our growing edifice of knowledge spreads more and more over a substructure of grants and votes, and the appliances needed for instruction and further research increase steadily in cost, even the affectation of a contempt for popular opinion becomes unwise. There's not only the danger of supplies being cut off, but of their being misapplied by a public whose scientific education is neglected, of their being deflected from investigations of certain to those of doubtful value. Like it or not, in these times, science popularization is increasingly important for science itself to progress. In conveying scientific findings to the public, it is simply a reality that certain details are going to be left out, oversimplified, or even inaccurately represented. This doesn't just apply to science, it also applies to other academic pursuits as well. For example, in U.S. schools, students are taught that Christopher Columbus had discovered the Americas and proved to a flat earth-believing society that the planet was round. In truth, the Western world had been quite aware of the shape of the planet since the time of the Greeks. Also, the significance of his voyage was not the discovery of the Americas, but the fact that his voyage to the Americas was the first to be able to turn a profit. This isn't done to deceive. It's done to teach basic U.S. history to children without having to go into lengthy explanations about economics or Greek philosophy, not to mention the more brutal aspects of the story. Even religious institutions are faced with a similar problem. For example, as there is a discrepancy amongst biblical scholars as to whether the Romans would have hammered nails through the palms or the wrists to crucify perceived challengers to the emperor's authority, churches are forced to speculate which possibility to present when depicting the crucifixion of Jesus. Also, in Williamstown, Kentucky, creationist Ken Ham has constructed a life-size version of the famed Noah's Ark using materials, technology, and engineering that couldn't have existed in the time of the flood narrative to construct an ark that can't possibly look like the structure described in the Genesis narrative. To visitors, it should be understood that some degree of inaccuracy will be there. They are there as visual aids only. Science educators and museums are faced with the very same task of finding a compromise between accuracy, simplicity, and entertainment. Since museums are by definition visual, there are some speculations that are necessary in reconstructing organisms and ecosystems that are extinct. For example, this skeleton is all we have to work with when reconstructing a dinosaur. While these bones would be enough for the science enthusiast to enjoy, the target audience of a museum is not the science enthusiast, but the general public, so a fleshed-out visual is necessary even if it doesn't completely represent the scientific consensus on how it might have actually looked. Up until the late 70s, theropod dinosaurs such as T-Rex were depicted standing completely upright with their tails dragging behind them. As scientists studied these fossils more closely, they were able to deduce more clearly that T-Rex had a more forward posture holding its tail up. This was not deception. It was the state of our scientific knowledge at the time, and the point was to make that knowledge easier to grasp by using visual displays. When reconstructing incomplete skeletons, scientists often composite multiple incomplete skeletons to build a full reconstruction, but sometimes not even that is possible. This is where educated guesses become very necessary. For another example, all we have for the reconstruction of the prehistoric shark megalodon is their teeth. To make a visual reconstruction, artists use clues from the shape and serration of these teeth and make the assumption that it might look similar to a modern great white, but on a larger scale. This may be completely wrong, as the actual shark may have been built far differently, either larger or smaller than initially predicted. And for all we know, the dorsal fin might be completely wrong, since we know that some ancient sharks had an anvil-shaped fin instead of a triangular fin. Meanwhile, other sharks like the goblin shark have pointy noses. We don't actually know what megalodons look like, but we do know they existed. This display is a best guess, and it serves the purpose of highlighting how extinct life might have actually looked, even if we can't guarantee complete accuracy. It is a visual aid, and this is how museum displays are constructed, because merely displaying teeth is boring. When the museum at the University of Michigan decided to feature a display on whale evolution, they consulted Phil Gingerich. One of the fossil transitionals featured was of the genus Rodhocetus, which Gingerich had discovered. Much like all potential whale ancestors, Rodhocetus' place in the whale lineage was determined primarily by the location of its nasal cavity, being further up the snout as if migrating toward the top of the head. This is coupled with the location of its inner ear, which is located further down as if in migration toward the bottom of the skull like in modern whales. As the fossil was incomplete, it featured no complete limbs and an incomplete tail. When Gingerich described this fossil in the April 1994 issue of the journal Nature, he included no representations of these features in Rodhocetus, as he could not substantiate any of them. In reconstructing the animal to appeal to the public, he would have to fill in those missing features as best he could. Due to the length of its neck and thorax, Gingerich speculated that it may have had fin-like appendages and a slight fluke to its tail, as the animal's body would require more leverage to propel itself through the water, as he also speculated that it was probably mostly aquatic. This reconstruction was never submitted for peer review. It was meant as a visual aid only. Incidentally, in 2001, Gingerich led a team in Balochistan, Pakistan, and discovered another fossil of Rodhocetus, but this time with complete front and rear limbs, which featured longer digits that were too frail for the animal to be an obligate land dweller. Although Gingerich has since speculated that his initial instinct regarding the tail were probably wrong, whether or not Rodhocetus had a fluke cannot be known, as even modern whale skeletons don't feature a fluke when they fossilize. This second discovery was featured in the journal Science in September of that year. When the Australopithecine Lucy was discovered, she had no hands nor feet, and of course no eyes, since eyes are also soft and don't easily fossilize. None of these features were present in any of the peer-reviewed work on Lucy, but reconstructing her for the public, the Laetoli footprints were used as the model for her feet, and her hands were the result of speculation based on the proportions of her legs to her arms. In 1974, Donald Johansen found the fossilized remains of what turned out to be 17 Australopithecine individuals, including the bones of hands and feet. As it turns out, the speculation on the shape of her hands was reasonably correct, while her feet show a little disparity from the Laetoli footprints. As for the whites in her eyes, the speculation was only in regard to the degree of white that was there, as even gorillas, chimps, and orangutans often have visible whites in their eyes. We can't know for sure what Lucy's eyes look like, but visible whites are far from a stretch, and again, the reconstruction was a visual aid. Science popularization is a pursuit that walks a cutting edge. On one end, the complete story is detailed and requires the discipline acquired through years of study to understand. On the other hand, the tax-paying public has far more immediately pertinent issues to deal with and requires a skilled condensation of the complete story. In the process of presenting this science, popularizers need to find a compromise between the two. It is inevitable that inaccuracies and oversimplifications will occur. What we can't do is blame the scientists for how this work is represented. They can only be held responsible for their own words and their own data, which is why, before rejecting the work of scientists, it's important to read their actual papers instead of relying on second- and third-hand accounts of their work. Displays in museums are merely visual aids for public understanding. Even in this series, I'm occasionally forced to oversimplify a topic, and sometimes I just make mistakes. This is why I provide direct references to experiment and observation in the description of all of these videos. And I encourage all of you to read the scientific work in the scientist's own words for yourself. In doing so, you'll see directly how creationism taught me real science. If there's a creationist argument you think I should investigate, please comment below. It may become the basis for a future episode. In the meantime, subscribe and make sure you don't miss it.